How do you express surprise at a small amount? You may say, "That's all." How do you end a topic? You may say, "That's enough about that." How do you say it's time to stop? You may say, "That's enough." What's a simple way to give approval? You may say, "That's good." How do you express uncertainty? You may say, "That's hard to say." What do you say when something is complete? You may say, "That's it." How do you react to unexpected good news? You may say, "That's a nice surprise." How do you confirm agreement? You may say, "That's right." How do you say someone understands you? You may say, "That's what I mean." What do you say when you find someone? You may say, "There you are." How do you show strong approval? You may say, "That's the way to go." How do you offer reassurance? You may say, "Things will work out all right." How do you ask for confidentiality? You may say, "This is just between you and me." How do you downplay the size or importance of something? You may say, "This is not much." How do you stress immediate attention? You may say, "This is urgent." How do you ask for confirmation on a choice? You may say, "This one." How do you say the outcome is uncertain? You may say, "Time will tell." How do you announce that time has run out? You may say, "Time's up." What do you say to show sympathy for a missed chance? You may say, "Too bad." How do you say something costs too much? You may say, "Too expensive." What do you say to encourage another attempt? You may say, "Try again." How do you say you're not entirely sure? You may say, "To the best of my knowledge." How do you ask for someone's confidence? You may say, "Trust me." What's a casual way to say no? You may say, How do you express extreme surprise? You may say, "Unbelievable." How do you say you're at your limit? You may say, "Up to here." How do you ask for a direction preference? You may say, "Up" or "down." What do you say to pause for a short time? You may say, "Wait a minute." What do you say to warn someone of danger? You may say, "Watch out." How do you ask someone to speak respectfully? You may say, "Watch your language." How do you say you share someone's situation? You may say, "We are in the same boat." What do you say when someone returns? You may say, "Welcome home." How do you compliment someone for a job well done? You may say, "Well done." How do you show disapproval for someone's boldness? You may say, "What a nerve." What do you say when you're relieved? You may say, "What a relief." How do you express disappointment? You may say, "What a shame." What do you say when you're relieved? You may say, "What a relief." How do you express disappointment? You may say, "What a shame." How do you ask for more information or clarification about a particular topic? You may say, "What about it?" How do you ask about your own status or situation in a discussion, especially when you feel overlooked? You may say, "What about me?"
How do you ask someone for their opinion, experience, or situation, often after sharing your own? You may say, "What about you?" How do you ask someone about their reason for being in a particular place? You may say, "What brings you here?" How do you ask someone to repeat what they said because you didn't hear or understand them? You may say, What did you say? How do you ask about someone's job or main activity? You may say, what do you do? How do you express surprise or approval, or ask someone about their knowledge on a topic? You may say, what do you know? How do you ask for clarification when you don't understand what someone is saying? You may say, what do you mean? How do you ask for someone's opinion about a specific thing or situation? You may say, what do you think of it? How do you ask for someone's opinion or thoughts on a subject? You may say, what do you think? How do you ask the purpose or reason for something? You may say, what for? How do you ask for information or clarification about something you don't recognize or understand? You may say, what is it? How do you ask for the reasoning behind someone's statement or opinion? You may say, what makes you say that? How do you ask about the current time? You may say, what time is it? How do you express confusion or ask for repetition because you didn't hear or understand what was said? You may say, what? How do you ask for the name of something? You may say, what's it called? How do you ask about the featured dish or offer at a restaurant or CAC? You may say, what's today's special? How do you show you agree without questioning? You may say, whatever you say. How do you ask about current events or the situation at hand? You may say, what's happening? How do you ask someone about their recent activities or changes in their life? You may say, what's new? How do you express confusion or disbelief about why something is considered important or problematic? You may say, what's the big deal? How do you ask for the purpose or reason behind something, especially when you're skeptical or annoyed? You may say, what's the point?
How do you greet someone and ask about their current activities or situation? You may say, what's up? How do you ask someone about a problem or issue they seem to be experiencing? You may say, what's wrong? How do you ask about the time at which something will occur? You may say, when? How do you ask about your current location, especially when you're lost or disoriented? You may say, where are we? How do you ask someone about their accommodations during a trip? You may say, where did you stay? How do you ask someone about their place of residence? You may say, where do you live? How do you ask for the location of a pharmacy or drugstore? You may say, where is a drugstore? How do you ask for the destination? Often in the context of a taxi or ride sharing service. You may say, where to? How do you ask for a specific choice or selection from a set of options? You may say, which one? How do you ask for the identity of someone, often when they're at the door or on the phone? You may say, who is it? How do you express uncertainty or acknowledge that something is unknown or unpredictable? You may say, who knows? How do you ask for the identity of someone on the phone, especially when you don't recognize their voice? You may say, who's calling? What do you ask to identify someone on the phone? You may say, who's calling? How do you ask for the identity of someone at the door, or in a place where you can't see them? You may say, who's there? How do you express surprise or regret that you didn't come up with a good idea or solution that someone else suggested? You may say, why didn't I think of that? How do you accept a suggestion or invite or challenge someone's negative statement or refusal? You may say, why not? How do you ask for the reason or cause of something? You may say, why? How do you ask if something is satisfactory or meets the required standards. You may say, "Will this do?" How do you offer a portion of what you have, such as food, drink, or goods? You may say, "Would you like some?" How do you say you're happy to do something? You may say, "With pleasure." How do you offer something to someone? You may say, "Would you like some?" What do you say when you're amazed? You may say, "Wow." What's a casual way to say yes? You may say, "Yeah." How do you say something is partly true? You may say, "Yes" and "No." How do you simply agree? You may say, "Yes." How do you say someone is fortunate in a fun way? You may say, "You are a lucky duck." How do you express frustration with someone? You may say, "You are driving me crazy." How do you compliment improvement? You may say, "You are getting better." What do you say when someone is very wet? You may say, "You are soaked." How do you say someone is joking with you? You may say, "You are teasing me."
How do you say someone is overly generous or funny? You may say, "You are too much." What's another way to say, "Absolutely"? You may say, "You bet." How do you challenge someone's statement? You may say, "You bet? You want to bet." How do you strongly agree? You may say, "You can say that again." How do you say you're not easily deceived? You may say, "You cannot fool me." How do you offer someone to go before you? You may say, "You first." How do you accept a compliment humbly? You may say, "You flatter me." How do you say someone understands? You may say, "You got it." How do you say you don't understand? You may say, "You have lost me." What do you say when someone calls you by mistake? You may say, "You have the wrong number."
How do you compliment someone's appearance? You may say, "You look good." How do you question someone's sanity humorously? You may say, "You must be crazy." How do you say any choice is possible? You may say, "You name it." How do you agree with someone? You may say, "You said it." How do you suggest someone needs to exercise? You may say, "You should get in shape." How do you say it's not someone's concern? You may say, "You stay out of it." How do you say someone overstepped boundaries? You may say, "You went too far this time." How do you admit defeat? You may say, "You win." How do you strongly agree? You may say, "You're telling me." How do you say an effort is futile? You may say, "You're wasting your time." How do you respond to thank you? You may say, "You're welcome." How do you ask someone to predict or make an educated guess about something? You may say, "Can you guess?" How do you request assistance or support from someone? You may say, "Can you help me?" What's your response when your friend shows you their new gadget? You may say, "Cool,"